Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I can see people are still joining to our joint SIG event. My name's Claire Tyson, and I'm one of the co-conveners of Practitioner Research. And we also have Kate Mawson representing the Higher Education SIG. And Joyce Chen is joining me as well. They're both going to introduce themselves, but I have to just say apologies from Emma Taylor, who sadly couldn't join us this evening. But welcome to our Ethics Showcase event, where we're following on from the work we did in April. Over to you, Joyce.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joyce Chen. I'm based at the Further Education College in Norfolk, and I'm one of the co-conveners for the Practitioner Research SIG. And welcome, everybody. And thank you for coming. And over to Kate.
Good evening, colleagues. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Kate Mawson. I'm currently at Nottingham Trent University. As Claire said, I convene the Higher Education Special Interest Group, but I'm also an active part of the Practitioner Researcher Special Interest Group as well. We're going to kick off this evening then with our first two presenters. We have Kate Russell and Lois Ferguson, both from the University of East Anglia. And they're going to talk to you today about their showcase piece, which is entitled Working with Gender Diverse Young People Without Parental Carer Consent, Negotiating a University Ethics System from PGR Student Supervisor and an Ethics Chair Perspective. Thank you both.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for the invite to be able to present this work today. So, yeah, my name is Kate Russell, and I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Education at the University of East Anglia. I'm Lois's primary supervisor for her PhD, but I'm also the University Research Ethics Chair at UEA.
And I'm Lois Ferguson. I'm a PhD student, and my research involves kind of exploring gender diversity within physical education settings in England. I'm in my final year of the PhD now, so I'm just in my writing up stage at the moment. So today we're going to share a little bit about this research project and the kind of navigating the ethics system that kind of took place. So I'll be sharing my perspective as a postgraduate researcher. I'll talk you through the research project itself, the ethical dilemmas that kind of emerged in the process, and some of the key steps that I took to kind of gain ethical approval without compulsory parental consent. And then I'll finish off with some of my reflections on that process.
And my contribution to tonight's session is to really look through this from the eyes of both the supervisor, but also in my kind of sense of being an ethics chair perspective. So wanting to support Lois through her research design and also the ethics review process that would happen within the school, coming from a position of knowing the ethics review system quite well, and also the introduction of a new online ethics review system that I was central to, and then I will complete with some reflections on the process too.
So a little bit about the research project. It involved working with gender diverse young people aged 11 to 18, and these were recruited through LGBTQ plus youth groups and organisations. We used a mixture of arts-based methods and semi-structured interviews and focus groups. And the kind of main aim was to learn about these young people's views towards PE, their experiences of PE within a secondary school setting. And as we kind of approached this project, we kind of considered that given previous research in this area, particularly in relation to LGBTQ youth, this is both in sport and educational context, there was an understanding that conversations with young people on this topic area were likely to be difficult. At times, they had the potential to bring up kind of emotional or distressing experiences, and so this was kind of deemed a sensitive topic in research terms. So with that, there came a sort of kind of ethical dilemma. When we look at the ethical landscape of working with young people in research, what we typically see is a focus on kind of risk avoidance over the rights of young people's participation. And this is particularly true with regard to sensitive topics. So, you know, this is because typically young people are positioned as in need of protection. due to their sort of perceived vulnerability or immaturity or innocence. And there's concerns over whether they would be able to cope with difficult or distressing conversations within a research context. So there's this really kind of paternalistic framing to their involvement in research, where adults ultimately make many of the decisions regarding young people's participation. And this is seen through a kind of largely blanket approach within institutional ethics requirements, where they are asked for parental consent or carer consent from anyone under the age of 16. But with this research project, there were kind of potential barriers and risks here that meant that meeting this requirement was potentially harmful and unethical. Some gender diverse young people aren't out to their parents or kind of carers, and actually being, and they might face kind of hostility in the home setting for being visibly trans or non-binary. And so asking for parental consent is not an option available to some of these young people. This in turn results in them being excluded from the research process, which then means that only certain voices are heard, those that have supportive home settings. Another possibility that could have come out here is that young people might put themselves in a difficult position by outing themselves in order to participate in the research, which again would put them at risk of harm at home.
So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of how ethics works at the university. So at UEA, we have 10 school and faculty-based research ethics committees, or SRECs, and each school and faculty have their own ethics review system. And this kind of operated on a separate basis until August 2021. We also then have a University Research Ethics Committee, which is often called UREC, which oversees then the research integrity and ethics at the university. So I'm the chair of the university level committee, and I get to see all university level projects and review them. So any outreach work, Athena Swan, staff surveys, etc. So all staff and student research projects are reviewed within the school and faculty level research ethics committees, and Lois's falls under the School of Education and Lifelong Learning, SREC. I've also been a chair of that committee prior to becoming the University Research Ethics Chair. So that gave me a sense of understanding about how education specific work is reviewed. As part of our development at the University of East Anglia, we've initiated a new online ethics review system that now operates a university-wide process to the review system, rather than having individualised systems operating in different kind of schools. So that's allowed for a sort of a consistent approach across the university, but also the new online system allows us to be able to track applications across years and to kind of keep track of where people are. So this new ethics monitor rolled out at the start of August 2021, which was during the time that Lois was developing her ethics application. So we knew that Lois was going to be one of the first people to actually use this new online system. So that just gives you a bit of a sense of the context.
Yeah, so when it came to thinking about how we could gain ethical approval without this compulsory approach to parental consent, there were a range of kind of steps that we took forward. And firstly, it was around kind of highlighting to the ethics board that actually, you know, young people are diverse and they kind of range in competency and maturity. And really, we tried to demonstrate that many young people could make these kind of informed decisions about their participation in research. I also indicated the potential for harmful outcomes to occur, such as the kind of things that I mentioned previously about outing themselves or being in kind of hostile home environments. I also kind of showed the ethics board that there were other successful frameworks that had been kind of developed from academics working in the fields of kind of young people, youth research and working with kind of sensitive topics such as sexuality and consent. And they'd kind of managed to do so without this compulsory parental consent approach. I also demonstrated my own kind of competency as a researcher in working with young people, that I was kind of approaching this with the kind of relevant knowledge. So things like getting kind of safeguarding training, showing my kind of years of experience in kind of youth work, understanding Gillick competence and the Fraser guidelines as a kind of way of working with young people. Yeah.
And linked to that is also kind of an understanding from many ethics committees about looking at the supervisory team and to see what kind of support there is going to be there for the student. So my own work in gender and sexual diversity was also a supportive mechanism for Lois as she was going through this process.
Yeah, and then the final 2 points were basically around demonstrating to the ethics board that whilst the young person might not have a supportive parent or carer at home, they did actually have other support systems available to them through the youth organisation that they were a part of, and that actually they could have another adult from the organisation act in loco parentis, so in place of the parent, and that they could kind of assess the young person's capacity to kind of make a decision and understand their involvement in the research. So that was the kind of key protocol that we followed in cases where the young person couldn't obtain parent or carer consent. And underpinning all of this really was a quote from BERA and their kind of ethical guidelines, which is around, regarding the best interests of the child being the central driver to their participation. So if the young person could demonstrate GILIC competence, but would be at risk of harm through obtaining parent or guardian consent, then the best approach was still to include them, but through other means. So my reflections on this process were many. Firstly, I've kind of put here the recruitment challenges. So we got ethical approval for this approach, but recruitment was very challenging and participant numbers were low. And at the end, all the participants that took part were happy and able to get parental consent. So we kind of went through this whole process and in the end didn't actually use these additional protocols. But that said, I think it was really important that we did still take this approach because it meant that we were making this research opportunity much more accessible to a wider range of young people. And actually, due to the novelty of this approach within our school anyway, at UEA, it meant that we kind of became experts in this new approach of kind of ethical approval, and it meant that I could then go and support other postgraduate students that were looking to do similar kind of projects and wanted some help on other ways of including young people without parental consent. It was a very time-consuming approach. There were many iterations of the application, kind of back and forth with the ethics board, but also a range of kind of additional documents that I had to put together. I've given a few examples on the left-hand side there of really detailed protocols that went to the youth organisations that we worked with, and also kind of really nuanced arguments that to prove why it was so important to the ethics board that we did it this way. It also highlighted that it wouldn't have been possible to use this approach unless there were close relationships with organisations, and this isn't something that all researchers have the capacity to do, depending on the kind of research design. And at the end of the day, it highlighted that although it was approved, it was on the basis of still requiring an adult to consent, even if it wasn't the parent or carer, kind of ultimately showing that they're still gatekeepers to young people's involvement in research. And I think the key takeaway from me was that all of the young people that did participate in our debriefs, they talked about how cathartic the experience was, how much they'd never been able to open up about these sorts of experiences, and it was a really kind of empowering process for them, which I think kind of strengthens the argument that we need to kind of shake up ethics policies a little bit to make research for young people more accessible, not just those that have supportive home lives. And that quote at the end, I think, just really encapsulates all of that.
And just some reflections on kind of my process. I guess it was slightly weird for me because while I was there to primarily to support Lois through her ethics kind of application, and as a supervisor, that's one of my kind of key roles, there were some kind of ethical dilemmas, some tensions for me as a university ethics chair about this process too. So as kind of Lois has spoken about, there was a real sense about, and in particular my role as an ethics chair is about wanting to support these types of projects. And in particular, within the School of Education, there was very little work that was actually explicitly being done around gender and sexuality diversity before I actually arrived, which is about 9 years ago. And so the ethics review team had actually quite limited experience and knowledge and understanding of this kind of field, and therefore perhaps an over concern at times about the types of things that might be kind of possible. So by engaging in this work, we were able to share that knowledge and understanding about what was expected. As the rollout of the new ethics online system, I know explicitly that, you know, my role as the university ethics chair made some choices kind of happen in the way in which the new ethics process kind of rolled out and the types of questions that were implemented within that. So if you can kind of remember that each school and faculty had a slightly different ethics application process with different types of questions being asked, different types of information being required. So now with this one system that kind of approached everything, I know that I was kind of privy to be able to actually ask explicitly for certain types of questions, and in particular to have this question about whether or not you did need to seek parental or guardian support for those who were under the age of 16. And also the system that was in place, because there were kind of word count limits to some of the sections, this actually made it quite difficult for Lois to provide all of the information, hence why she had to develop all these extra kind of protocols. So these things were really kind of brand new generally to the ethics application process across university. So our social work colleagues have the capacity and have worked with projects where they would need to consider the potential risk of a child disclosing certain bits of information, but generally across the university this wasn't happening. There were other then kind of tensions since then about perhaps other schools seeing this perhaps as a way in to try and avoid asking for parental or guardian consent. So for like large scale work in schools where gaining consent can actually be a little bit tricky kind of at times. So we've had to be really mindful of how we manage that process. And certainly I think there is this kind of sense that actually we are kind of supporting the further development of the university across the board by adding in these capabilities so that we're not potentially limiting research in this area kind of in the future. And just to kind of finish off just by providing some of those key resources that Lois did there. So thank you for your time and for listening. For us now, over to Kate. I'll stop sharing now the screen.
Thank you both. That was really interesting, and I've noticed that we've got 3 questions in the chat. As I was listening to you, and I'm thinking about possibly previous roles I've had in schools when researchers come and ask to do research with our young people. Could you talk to me or the audience about maybe what responses you got from your organisations? I know you said you had really close relationships which helped this research to get underway, but what might those organisations have said to you when you think about informed consent? What kind of messages were you sharing with them, or what kind of questions maybe came back from them about you not requiring parental consent?
Yeah, I think given that they were LGBTQ youth organisations, I think they had a pretty kind of clear awareness already of a lot of the struggles and difficulties that these young people might have in the home setting, and also an understanding that they are often unheard and kind of silenced in lots of different kind of contexts. And so the way that I kind of communicated it to them was in that sense of, you know, we are really lacking an understanding of how these young people feel. And this is a really great opportunity to include not just those that, you know, have these supportive home lives, but those that are the least kind of heard. And they were on board with it, really. I think, although I said recruitment was tricky because I had kind of a couple of close organisations, and then unfortunately one had to kind of drop out, so that kind of reduced numbers quite significantly. But the time it took to develop those relationships was a long time. So to do it on a wider scale just requires so much more time. But yeah, for those that were kind of on board, they were very kind of grateful for this sort of approach, because it meant that they had young people that they worked with that were actually, you know, being empowered and listened to and that sort of thing. Yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you so much. Kate, did you want to come in, or are we happy to move to the next question?
I'm happy to move. Lois is the expert of working with the organisation. She did a brilliant job. So yeah, happy with that.
Excellent, thank you. So from the chat, I can't see any hands up. Please wave at me or shout if you have your hand up. So from the chat, we've got a question from Amelia Roberts. Amelia asks, have you published this nuanced approach to ethical approval? She's finding it very interesting.
Not yet, but it's in the plan. So as Lois said, she's in the writing up stage, hoping to submit in September. But that is part of our I guess our wider publication plan for Lois, really, to make sure that these things, they seem really important, and I think it can take away a bit of the scariness as well about trying to do work in this area as well. So we're definitely aiming to do something like that. Lois is definitely aiming to do that.
Excellent. And I'm not sure if it's of use to anybody listening or indeed to Lewis. There are some really nice journals that focus on ethical practice, so it could be a nice opportunity to maybe target one of them. Another question, this one's from Claire, so thank you, Claire. Did you consider having a young person as a co-researcher at all if you're thinking about participatory research?
Yeah, so the actual first step of this project was a scoping activity, and the aim was to have a sort of advisory team of young people that would co-create and co-design the next steps. Unfortunately, this was during COVID, and there was not as much kind of sign up involved. I basically have worked with a youth group for quite a long time now, and there was a group of young people there that seemed really keen to kind of develop this advisory team and really inform the next steps of my research. But then COVID happened and it all went online, and there was just it just kind of shut things down. People weren't wanting to engage in online approaches, and so I'd planned and got ethical approval to do this scoping activity and to have co-researchers that came and had lots of input and contribution, but in the end it didn't happen because people didn't want to meet online, and that was the only option at that point. So yeah, but it was my ideal plan.
Often we have to change as we go along, don't we? And we've still got a few minutes left for questions, so I would just suggest to audience, if you do have a question, you can either write it in the chat or raise your hand. So to both of you then, we might have some practitioners in the audience who don't have the benefit of a university ethics committee to talk to. Would you have any advice or guidance for maybe some of our practitioners who are engaging in research about conversations they might have with their schools or governing body or their settings, governing bodies, about good places or resources to have a look at when we're thinking about either gender sensitive issues or young people under 16?
Yeah, I mean, from an ethics kind of a reviewer kind of perspective, we know that we have quite a lot of sort of partner organisations, or certainly certain groups who aren't part of a university setting who would like to do this type of work, and often come to us to get perhaps what they perceive to be kind of ethical approval, or we can give a notification. I'm just trying to remember the exact kind of phrase that we used, a favourable opinion kind of about the process, and our encouragement with them is often to try and find somebody within the university setting that could perhaps become a collaborator or a co-I on the project, because then they're able to access the university level research ethics committee, rather than, so they get full approval and all of the backup and the support that we can kind of offer, rather than having to sort of manage these things by themselves. So I guess that's our suggestion for people who perhaps don't have as much experience, or know that if they're planning on publishing, for example, journals are going to ask if they've had ethical approval. So they need to, often they will need to kind of access something kind of like that. So our approach at the university is to kind of go, we're happy to support, but really see if someone who's doing similar work as you that could come on board and then be the UEA person, and then you can access all of our support systems in that way.
Lovely, thank you. And I think possibly all of us on the panel or your nearest HEI would be keen to hear from people and practitioners. I've got one question in the chat, and then I've got a hand raised. So apologies if I don't pronounce your name properly. I think it's Jan back here who says, you said it was a time-consuming process. Could you share how long maybe this took? And this is, I think, where that academic piece of string comes in, and these things can take a while. So about how long did this take you?
Go on, Lois.
I can't remember now.
It felt a long time.
Yeah,
I
several
think
months, definitely, just to get an application Yeah.
And I think that there was so much pre-work, because I knew what the ethics committee were going to be looking for and what type of questions they were going to ask, to try to prevent too much of it going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. Lois did so much work beforehand that even though the ethics committee still wanted some greater clarification about certain things, it was still a couple of months probably, wasn't it, before you got final approval. And a lot of that was just because the committee weren't as familiar with the topic, weren't familiar with the processes that were involved, and so we're just asking lots of extra questions that perhaps somebody with additional levels of experience might have understood some of the the protocols that Lois put in place. So sorry, it's not necessarily a quick go at this type of work.
No, I think institutions usually 8 weeks is about a normal kind of turnaround for any ethic application, and then if it is slightly more complicated, I think three to 4 months is not unheard of. I think Claire, did you have your hand up? I think maybe you've just popped it down. Apologies.
No, I popped it down because I saw there's another good question in the chat. But very quickly, I will very quickly just ask, did you approach safeguarding staff in school? Is it a school setting? Did you at all? If you were using a school setting, would you consider approaching the school safeguarding pastoral staff as a proxy for parents?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, this is sort of what I advised another postgraduate researcher who's looking to do that, because she'd wanted to go through the school approach. I mean, the reason we didn't go through the school approach is because they were talking about their teachers and about the school setting, and I think there was always a concern from the young people that they would be, if they were talking kind of negatively about their experiences, that would come back to them. So this is one of the reasons we went through the kind of youth organisation. But yeah, I think, I don't know what you'd suggest, Kate, but I think a pastoral figure or a safeguarding figure that knows the young person in a school setting could work. I think they have to have had some sort of relationship rather than it just being like another adult. So with the youth groups, they worked with them every week or every 2 weeks and developed quite kind of close relationships. So yeah,
I mean, that's the challenge of in terms of like thinking about like where you want to find your participants, because the gatekeeper of that organization needs to kind of go, yes, that's great, come on in. So that was one of the reasons why we decided that probably wasn't the best option for a school then, because then the head and the other teachers are around, would have to kind of allow access to have some time to work with those pupils, and again, if those pupils didn't want to be so out in that space or found it to be risky, that we didn't want to kind of add that layer on. Ethics generally, well, certainly kind of at UEA, we don't allow teachers to have in loco parentis kind of rights for these kind of participation levels. So we'd have to look really carefully about the role of the safeguarding officer and whether or not they were like a separate person versus, say, just a teacher of that particular school. We wouldn't usually permit that to kind of happen. I think in previous kind of working schools, it was very much like, well, if a teacher says it's okay for you to participate, you just get on and do that. And we just don't do that approach anymore. So that makes it a bit of an extra challenge for us.
It'd be really nice if your findings are added to the next lot of BERA guidelines about working with young people.
Yeah, I think that leads quite nicely. We've probably got 30 seconds or so maybe not a huge amount of time or a minute. Molly Mesher asks, in a situation such as a practitioner researcher in a school who doesn't have the support of an organisation, what advice would you give them for undertaking this sort of ethical approval? So without quashing all over your opportunity to answer questions, I think if you are an active research school, you should have an ethical commitment, or an ethics policy. So I think possibly you want to speak to your governors and your head about making a policy. You can use BERA's ethical guidance. Obviously, we would advise you to use BERA 2018 ethical guidance, but it really does take some thinking about. There's been some research which suggests that schools sometimes engage in research without due consideration of ethics. Ladies, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just think that if you're going to be like a research school, to have something that's kind of embedded in there, and then also you can specify that you might have extra kind of levels of ethical considerations that you want to have into consideration specifically for your school context. Whereas a university level one will kind of go, well, these principles generally should be okay, but then in your school you might have particular populations or particular ways of working or particular topics that you're happy with and perhaps not happy with. So if you are a research school, you want to kind of almost have like your own kind of like ethical committee there who's going to be able to overview those sorts of things. And I would encourage you, to link up with perhaps one of your local HEIs to get that extra level of support too.
That's lovely. So thank you ever so much for a really interesting presentation. It's generated quite a lot of chat. So we're going to hand back now to Claire to move us on to the next. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. That was amazing. So a really great way to kick off. We've now got Louise Archer, who's joining us from the Institute of Education at UCL. And Louise is talking to us about the project that I believe was probably with one of her students or colleagues, anyway, working with global makerspace practitioners. And it's learnings from an international participatory research project. Welcome, Louise.
Thank you very much. I will try and share my screen. Is that coming up there?
It is.
Fantastic. Is that big enough, or do I need to put it on a different setting?
I can read it.
Okay, fab. Great. So I'm going to talk about our work, and I'm presenting also on behalf of my colleague Meghna, who's had to go overseas, about our work with global makerspaces. And I think, in essence, what we're hoping to share is that, in our experience, issues of ethics are sort of an ongoing, unfolding process of negotiation that isn't done and dusted at the moment that we got the ethical approval or did the forms. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our project, and then I'm just going to run through some of the key challenges and how we're trying to address them without claiming that they have been addressed. So our project is international. It's trying basically to understand, develop and share equitable and inclusive practices in what we call makerspaces. So makerspaces are often sort of like workshops. They're informal learning sites which have access to a range of tools, resources and experiences. It can range from digital things to saws or needles or clay, or it can be a whole load of things. But we're particularly looking at those which have the capacity to use kind of more innovative science, technological and engineering based making towards social good. And we're particularly interested in these spaces as offering the potential to give meaningful experiences and support the voice and agency of young people from communities that are excluded and underrepresented, both generally and also specifically in relation to STEM learning. There's 5 of us on the research team, and we work with 7 makerspaces from 5 countries. There's some photos of them there. They look a little bit small, but as you can see, we've got partners in USA, Nepal, the UK, Slovenia, and also partners in Gaza, in Palestine. Now, given the situation at the moment, I did just want to pause and focus for a moment on our partners in Palestine and Gaza, who obviously right at this minute are not able, our project's ongoing, are not able to work with us right at this moment due to the conflict there. There's just some information about them and their what they do and their focus on trying to support active citizenship, climate, sustainability, and particularly working with girls and young women. And we just wanted to remember one of the young women from the project, from the space, who has died, and indeed all the children who have died and continue to suffer, and the young people in not only this conflict on both sides, but around the world. So our project is a 4-year research and development project. So we're both trying to understand, do research, but also develop resources and approaches in collaboration with our practitioners and our youth. So young people are involved as youth co-researchers on the project, and we do co-design with the practitioners as well. So as I said, we're interested in what's equitable practice, how can it be enhanced and shared in these spaces, with a particular focus on gender, race, ethnicity, religion, disability, neurodiversity and social class. So these spaces, I mean, we love working with practitioners and with young people, but the variety of the spaces can also provide some challenges as well. We've got, they range in size, in focus, in funding, in the sorts of roles that the practitioners play in those spaces. You can see some example roles there. And we also then try and work with groups of about 5 to 10 young people as youth co-researchers in each makerspace. And their ages are also quite broad, from 11 up to 30. We're obviously following the BERA ethical code, but we're quite interested in how research ethics is this kind of lived process that's structured by power relations. So we've been interested in ideas of social justice and ethics, not only in relation to our research topic, but also in terms of how do we embed and live that in our research practice, both with each other within a research team and in relation to the young people and in relation to the practitioners and the spaces. So examples of what we mean by how we interpret that is, for example, making sure we try and adopt assets-based, non-deficit approaches towards working with the practitioners and young people, trying to use participatory and co-design approaches, recognising and supporting voice and agency, and so on. In doing so, I'd say we've identified these kind of key challenges, which I'll just talk through quickly in turn and give you a sense of what they've meant in our project. So the first area is often thinking about power relations. Obviously, power is key to notions of ethics and social justice. So how we negotiate that between researchers, practitioners and youth. So, for example, how do we make sure that we are doing co-production, using techniques like co-authoring, ensuring that we're sensitive to and using different sorts of registers, using reflexivity, adopting a learning stance where we're all learning together. And we're really trying to do that researching with and trying not to do researching to or for. And really also paying attention to the process of that. We're also aware that beyond ourselves, when we have lots of meetings and workshops together across within organisations, between and across the partnership, that we're very aware of that difference between power in terms of the voices from global north and global south. And we've had to really reflect a lot and think about how we structure those inputs. I think there's always a tendency for those of us if in privilege, well, privilege in general, but those of us in privileged positions in the global north to kind of dominate the agenda, even if we don't mean to. So we've had to think about how we do that, how we mix up the formats, how we structure those spaces really. And then also being attentive to ethics within organisations. Obviously, we're using anonymity and confidentiality, but then in workshop and partnership work like this, sometimes people may worry, a practitioner may worry about saying things that their senior leadership may not want to hear or may not want aired publicly, and so on. And I think particularly, as I showed in the earlier slide, we have named partners. They're named on our websites. And then when we want to report data, we have to be very careful about how we maintain confidentiality and anonymity, while also recognising the really valuable inputs that those partners make. So this feeds into these notions of confidentiality and anonymity, how we balance those. One of the things we've been working with our practice partners to do is to use co-constructed composite case studies. So we work with them to find core elements that may be common or vary across different case studies and build composite ones that can't be attributed to a single space, but which still have the truth of the data and the evidence from those settings, and always making sure that everything we produce is approved by our participants as well. Obviously, that notion of using meetings as confidential and anonymous and not getting shared outside the meeting as well would be fairly standard. Recognising and valuing differences, I think, has been another ethical and social justice consideration. And I think really sort of recognising that everyone comes to this, particularly in a multi-partner project with people of different ages, different positions, different countries and so on, that everyone's at different points, and how do we value and recognise everyone's different positionality within that. for us, also thinking about outputs and recommendations, that being really aware that there's no one size fits all, and how do we give stuff that's useful and valuable, which is what our practice partners want, whilst also being adaptable and responsive to the fact that there is no one experience that speaks to every context. And obviously the usual difficulties over language, we also, speak different languages, have different geopolitical contexts, and so on. So we've tried to adopt an equity model, which is giving differentially according to need and not using one thing that fits everyone. In terms of positionality, I think this is something that we've talked about within our research team, with our partnership a lot, that sort of, how do you grapple with that complexity of our different positionings? So one thing that we've tried to look at in our analyses is how do we interrogate the different, what Diane Ray calls the differences that our differences make. So how do we see how those co-produce different forms of output, different forms of findings within our data? We try and use a critical form of reflexivity. I think that's often difficult to do it. Well, sometimes it's easy, but the times when it's most needed is when it's difficult. And I think that notion of embracing discomfort is always really important, because when we're talking about challenging power and unsettling privilege, it has to be uncomfortable or we're not doing it, because it's about challenging the status quo. And I think particularly recently, that notion of positionality and the ethics of how do we behave as researchers has been blurred, particularly. So in my own example, I found a shifting and a blurring of boundaries between the personal and professional in terms of how I ethically feel I want to support our partners in Gaza. So I would never normally have extended WhatsApp chats with a professional partner, but in this case it has felt really important and part of the ethics and practice of what we hope is love-based caring pedagogy, like that Bell Hooks writes about, and that notion of the personal as professional, political feminism. And then finally, the area around, we feel is an important part of our interpretation of ethics is that we're not just the critical secretaries of society. We're not just trying to identify and name inequalities, although that's really important and a really important part of critical research practice, but also how do we support change as well. So how do we really start to get to grips with challenging the status quo and so on. So as I mentioned, part of that for us is that notion of being comfortable to be reflexive in our own positions, work with discomfort ourselves, support our practice partners and the young people to work with discomfort as well, and trying to build that into our ways of working so that we have weekly critical professional reflective practice sessions with our partners. And this is something that we've co-developed with the people, the practitioners and young people that we're working with. And there's just a couple of quotes there from some of our practice partners saying that they have welcomed this approach. They talk about, some donors give them a lot of money, but just kind of want that last report, the output, the numbers. But they experience this as a different form of working. And what one of the quotes is calling that reflective mentorship is saying that they feel that it's been enriching and engaging for them, and that they are more motivated to work with us because they can see that it fits with their needs and their values, and is a sort of ethical approach in their view. It's not an exploitative research relationship, or at least we're hoping it's not, which I think often is an ethical consideration of research. Research can be exploitative, even research that follows often quite important ethical guidelines. So our concluding point is that we're experiencing this as an ongoing negotiation. It's a process, a journey, and we definitely don't feel we've perfected it. But we think that notion of actively continuing to engage with ethical issues is really important. It's enriching for us, and it feels like the right thing. And working both with practitioners and the young people. And I just wanted to put a quote there from one of our young people talking about the importance of youth voice, because, as I say, young people see things differently. They're not often listened to, but they do have really important things to say. And I say that goes the same for our practice partners too. So thank you on behalf of some of the young people there and all of our practitioners, and I look forward to the chat, the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. That's really interesting, and I've been a great fan of your science capital work for quite a while. So it's really nice to see what your work is now. And I think there's a bit of science capital in there. I could definitely ask questions about that, but I can see that Kate Russell has an interesting question in the chats. Would you like to, Kate, would you like to ask that question yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. I'm intrigued by this because it's something that comes up quite a lot when you're obviously you're working with such a diverse range of partners, not only just say even within the UK, but obviously your partners are kind of around the world. So how do you manage what might be quite different approaches or expectations or ideas around how to work with participants in different places? And like, was it you guys that got the ethics approval and then had to try and, I don't want to use the word impose, but you know what I mean? You're going to have to try and get everybody to sort of agree to those kind of ways of working, and how might that have worked in with some of your partner groups?
Yes, thank you. I mean, obviously, yes, we did have the overall ethical approval for the funded project is the UCL one there. And then that gets shared with the partners and the participants, but some of them also have their own procedures to go through as well. So like one of our organisations, in order to work with their young people, has to go through the ethics processes in their district and with the schools as well. So they sort of layer on, but I think it's important, I think, that they also have that kind of dual layer, because there are often, you know, specificities of particular contexts, and you need to be able to work within those boundaries as well. So it sort of feels like these overlapping circles, and there are, you know, Venn diagrams. There are some things which are core and the same, and some things which might be additional. Can
I ask a question? Had you finished? Yeah. So I was really interested in, had the ethics become very central to the project as your common language at the end of the day? Was it the ethics itself that became the core, do you feel?
I think ethics writ large, yeah, so ethical considerations. I'll say, so the idea of social justice and what that can mean in research. So I suppose I'm quite interested in, it feels like sometimes the technicality of the ethics that we go through at the university level, which is all important, and the sort of core baseline important stuff, like, you know, informed consent, things that are really important, valuable. But then there feels like there are also what I would say slightly more wider political ethical issues around doing social justice research, which don't, for me, aren't embedded in the forms we do and that consent we get, but which still, to me, feel an important part of what I would consider to be the ethics. So yes, sorry, I feel that I've just rambled and not answered your question.
There was very much a sense that the kind of ethical, perhaps it's like ethics with a big E and ethics with a little e, isn't it? There is a sort of sense in which your project is inherently ethical. I think that's what.
Yes, and I think exactly. And I think those principles, those ethical principles, of the notions of being a participatory research, of assets-based approaches, I see those are the core things that, yes, that underpin and are the writing through the stick of rock that go through our project.
Yeah. I can see Joyce has got her hand up. You've got a question, Joyce?
Not exactly a question. Just want to share that when you talk about the sort of ethical dilemmas and issues in a wider sense, the big E, I think I can really resonate with it, because actually at the end of the day, it's the everyday practice, you know, underpinning what we do, but it's particularly central to research, I think. And the political environment also impacts on those, you know, situations. So I think it's almost like you can't have this one size fits all ethical guidance, you know, because again, you know, there's so many elements of it to be considered. And appreciate your work, and obviously thinking about, you know, those people who have been affected. And I think that is so important. I'm just wondering what happens next, because obviously this project have some sort of levels of impact, you know, after this event at the moment, what's going on. So just wondering, you know, what are you going to take this forward, you know, in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think thank you. I mean, obviously our project is still ongoing now, which we're continuing as much as we can. And it has felt, I mean, again, communicating particularly with our partners in Gaza who can't participate at the moment, for them, they've been telling me it feels really important to them when we're sharing that they're in the research, when we're sharing it publicly. It also feels like important, and they appreciate that. But going forward, yes, I think we're now rethinking. Before things changed so radically, we had a sort of quite nice, neat idea of, okay, now we'll come up with these resources and these findings, and then we'll disseminate them, and that'll be. And I think we're sort of radically rethinking now. How does that happen in all the settings, given that, for example, our current partners in Gaza, their physical space has been literally destroyed. It's near Al Shifa, in that district. So it means different things. Yes, so a complex but hopefully ongoing way forward in the future.
I'm wondering if the necessary discussion has actually really enhanced the research in a way that if you'd had shared context and a shared understanding, the research might have been more superficial. In this as sort of, has this brought extra dimensions to your research, do you think?
I think it's definitely been it's helped to provoke. I think it's easy to become complacent in research, and when I've researched these sorts of issues for quite a long time, and I think it's always important to be out of your comfort zone in terms of learning that things change, and the certainties that maybe I take for granted in my privileged position, in the university in the global north, and those, I think that notion of challenging your Eurocentrism, your privileged centrism is really important, and but equally, I'm sure my partners would rather not have not had to happen, but I think it's a general principle that we do need to decenter more and learn from others and other experiences.
Do any of our other presenters have questions for Louise? Or indeed people who are...
Yeah, I have my hand up.
Oh, I beg your pardon, I couldn't see that. Hello, Amelia.
Hi. Yeah, actually, it follows on beautifully from your question, Claire, about the role of the ethical reflection actually impacting on the research results. And I'll just give you a really quick example. A while ago, I did a very small project looking at therapeutic encounters with horses for children who were in need. And we spent a lot of time thinking about, were these encounters ordinary? Could they have been offered as part of an ordinary portfolio? And we only included children for whom we felt that this could be an ordinary part of their offering. But the bit that changed the results for me was we had funding for 3 sessions. And at the end of 3 sessions, me and the facilitator both felt really strongly that to stop the process then would actually be quite harmful to the children. So we self-funded actually 3 additional sessions. And we didn't feel the same at all after 6 sessions. So 3 felt like we were just asking children to trust a new experience and then pull it away. At the end of 6 sessions, it didn't feel wrong at all to stop. And I found it fascinating that it was a question of ethics that actually led to what I thought was the most interesting finding.
Thank you. That's amazing. We've literally got 3 minutes. If anyone has any further thoughts or reflections, if no one else has got their hand up, I apologise if I can't see. I do have a thought. I was interested in how you address differences in levels of research skills, because that's something I've come across when trying to work with student researchers, and therefore you have perhaps similar inequalities. How did you address that? Did you offer training, for example?
Yes, so when we work with the youth co-researchers, we always have workshops with them, first of all, introducing them to research skills, to ethics, of course, and then the notions of co-production as well, and what that means, so and how we would like to work with them. So yeah, I think otherwise it's kind of impossible for them to it's important to level the playing field, doesn't it? So it gives some parameters that people, and some knowledge that they can then work with and rework and adapt and use.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant. And thank you so much for explaining a very complicated case very succinctly in the time as well. So if there are no further, is there no further questions? Have I missed anything? Checking. What I would like to do then is I'm going to hand over to Joyce, who is going to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Louise. Yeah, that clapping hands there, I can see. Thank you. Our next presenter is Cara. Cara is a doctoral student at the University of Plymouth, and her main research interests are in social justice in education and society, inclusion, and access to higher education, communities, and policy. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Cara. Thank you. And please put questions and thoughts in the chat as well along the way. Thank you.
Thanks, Joyce. I'm just going to share my screen, and if you can give me a big yes or no once it comes up, that would be amazing. And then I can get started, but you know how these things are.
Yeah,
that comes through now.
Yeah, lots of thumbs up there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks, Joyce, for that introduction. And such great presentations already this evening. So I'm really looking forward to continuing these discussions. So I'm Cara. I'm one of the doctoral students at the University of Plymouth. And today I'm specifically going to talk about working through and with ethics in participatory intellectual disability research, which is becoming a core part of my PhD that I never really anticipated. But has become a really exciting finding that I'm working with. So I come to share some of my thoughts, experiences, and navigations of all of that. So if we can move on. So I just wanted to give a quick study overview. So my work is set in a sports group for adults with intellectual disabilities, and I flip between adults with intellectual disabilities and disabled people intentionally, as that's the ask of my participants, really, as they all identify differently. So if you pick up on that, that will be why. Not that the sports aspect is core in this work, but really the inclusive community that is developed. This is a participatory project, working with, not on, drawing on some of Nine's work there. And really, I'm exploring the development of inclusive communities and what that looks like, and how do they exist, and how might we learn from those. But when I submitted the PhD proposal, I never anticipated that working inclusively and inclusive research was going to be such a core finding and something that I grappled with so much. So secondly, I'm looking to illustrate how working inclusively and ethically with adults with intellectual disabilities as researchers, and exploring the influence of the opportunity to become researcher. So that's just a snapshot. I'm using practitioner research and insider research kind of synonymously here, where I'm an insider of the community that I'm researching, and I've volunteered with for 6 years now. And just wanted to pull out some really core points about being an insider and what difference that can make. Not an insider in the sense where I don't have a disability, but an insider in the sense that I'm familiar with the space. I consider people in the space friends, colleagues, so we're figuring that out and working through that. But there's a value in understanding that context, whilst many would challenge it. And the collective knowledge and lived experience can produce some practical and tangible results through knowing what might work best for the group that you're working with or supporting. Of course, we've got to be aware of research bias and participant bias. But truly, I see it as being in a prime position to support change for those that I'm working with. The initial ethics of this project, combining participatory work and intellectual disability work, has been a really underrepresented intersection. The disabled community are continually not afforded the same recognition within social justice as other underrepresented groups, whilst that is increasing, and that's really positive. But there is this double layer of ethical complexity and sensitivity in that, in working through the ethics of a participatory project, be that with young people, be that with higher education students, be that with people with disabilities. And then bringing in that complexity around capacity and consent, which I'll talk to in a bit. So participatory projects on the whole take longer to approve, and ethics may need revisiting multiple times. And this is something I've really experienced throughout my project. And since intellectual disability is categorized as a vulnerable characteristic in ethics, in procedural ethics, particularly where I'm working in, that was something that was a hurdle that needed navigating. So drawing on VERA 2018 guidance, of course, there was some things I needed to be aware of in terms of protection from harm and clarity of the research that I was trying to produce. But the first stumbling block was when I opened up the ethics form and got approached with the question, are your participants considered vulnerable, or does your project include people who are vulnerable, and in brackets, intellectual disability, young people, those kinds of things? And I find that really problematic in this initial sense, because I knew these people, I've worked with them a long time, and I didn't want to make assumptions on their levels of capacity. And actually, the Mental Capacity Act, it states that we must assume that people have capacity, not the other way around. And this first hurdle of this ethics process felt like it was making me do that, since you can't consult your participants and really know if this is the situation for them until you've gained ethical approval. Like Lois and Kate, who were discussing earlier, I did find the process prescriptive and rigid at times, with a lack of space for clarity. The panel wanted concise explanations, and I just did not have them. And I'll talk you through those methods shortly. And I found at times it felt very reductionist, that assumed projects were similar. My ethics approval, from first opening up the landing page to submitting, amending, and then submitting an on-the-ground amendment as well after I'd started, it took 12 months altogether and many iterations, 21 additional documents in the original application and 10 in the amendment application. So it really requires a deep desire and a deep drive to produce this kind of work and to work in these spaces that not everyone has the time or capacity to do. So I'm just going to talk you through a multi-methods approach that I took to provide multimodal access points to my participants, athletes, we can call them. There are talking and non-talking participants, and there was levels of participation that some athletes were willing to do and some were not. And also there was a level of control that I felt I needed to have as a PhD researcher who had a thesis to write and has certain elements that need to be achieved in a certain amount of time. So I started off with some participatory diagramming, which invited the athletes to contribute to spider diagrams, mind maps, do some drawings, write their ideas to some prompts and that I had. This was a very informal introduction to my research. So in that way, it became a very gentle introduction to research to a group that had not been involved in research before I even considered inviting anyone to become a co-researcher. It was important that we introduce what research was. And this was a very gentle activity to do that. Moving on, I did one-to-one interviews with these participants, and for other members, volunteers, support workers, I included a survey to hear their perspectives too. Stage 3 involved the real core participatory work that I was hoping to achieve, where I invited people to become participant researchers, an opportunity to research what is important to them. And that's going on as we speak, which is a really exciting step in the research. And I've got some very enthusiastic members of my research committee, as they've called it, which is something that is really exciting. And I'm really, really pleased to be able to explore that. But it didn't come easy. So I've really worked on a continuum of participation, as Brown discussed, in a way that different people are comfortable with different levels of participation, and I'm comfortable with different levels of participation too, and I still have some needs and some things that I need to achieve. The ethics panel had some questions and had some concerns about this participant-led activity that I was asking approval for. Because actually, I can't know what they want to explore until I've asked them. And I felt in this quandary where I felt like I was expected to know the unknowns and give answers for something that was so exploratory and participatory. And I resisted for a little while, as my PhD supervisors would know. But what I ended up doing was mapping out this diagram, which was helpful for me and for the panel to see what activities were likely to happen and what I was in control of, and what potential research activities might have happened. And this just gave flexibility to the panel to know that I have an idea of what might come up. But this was submitted with a caveat that I would come back to the panel and request an amendment if my participants wanted to do something else, if the participant researchers did not want to do what I thought they might have liked to do. So it was a dedication to be flexible here. It was really important. So the procedural ethics, I needed to clarify a few things to the panel before I could get approval. So one of the things was how to inform participants who had not studied or engaged in research before or knew about ethics. How were my participant researchers, my co-researchers, going to know about confidentiality, especially those who have different levels of capacity? How are my co-researchers going to know what they can share and can't share? How do we balance that safeguarding? How do we boundary the space? How do we set ground rules? So in the creation of additional forms as to what the focus groups might look like, I also needed to develop a code of conduct, a declaration of confidentiality that co-researchers and those that they choose to invite to the focus group would sign, and keeping that really safe. And it was really important that supported decision making was invoked, but on the whole, participants were assumed to have capacity unless otherwise, as most of the participants did. And for those that did not, there was an informed supported decision making process where athletes were asked first, and parents, support workers, families were asked second. So balancing that was really interesting. As this is very much about ethics in practice, I'd gained approval and off I went to do my participatory diagramming, and there was some interest and questions, and it was really exciting to see them engaging in the research in this way. But what I started to notice was that they were much more comfortable together. So where I'd gained approval for one-to-one interviewing, actually they preferred to come in a pair. So I had to be responsive and apply for an amendment in order to make sure that my participants were as comfortable as possible in those spaces. So because exploratory work is uncertain, I felt quite unsure a lot of the time about what decisions needed to be made, because my participants aren't aware of the project or what being a researcher requires until then. So it really requires a dedication to be flexible. Driven by participant needs, not researcher intentions, whilst the stage and structure was driven by what bits that I needed to collect or wanted to collect, and bits that the co-researchers could collect. Each stage within that was driven by what they needed. But something I'm really pondering with now is, as my co-researcher element comes to an end, what happens with finishing participatory work? I've been doing my data collection now since February, and they're very comfortable with this happening, and it feels unjust to turn around at the end of December and say, right, that's it, no more research committee. So that is something that, because I'm an insider, I feel I can continue and carry on, and feel it's really important to do so. Protection is paramount, and I understand the desires and the needs of the ethics committees. But I think sometimes it serves to reproduce the same kind of research. So just to draw to some critical considerations, from my experience with the 12 months, I had some time, but there is a time and funding conundrum, especially for people doing grant work or bid work. And a willingness to be flexible is not always enough. There are boundaries on research projects with how much time you can give or how much money something might need. Sometimes in my tick the box example, it felt the ethics processes were more interested in characteristics. Are your participants vulnerable, rather than the stories and the experience? And as someone in a position of privilege and hierarchy, I had the power to continue to label and name, and that didn't feel quite fair. And I think we're in fear of procedural ethics reproducing the same kind of research with the same kind of participants if, like all of these case studies tonight, we're really pushing to explore and to push those boundaries. But it does require a more collective effort, and I wonder what that might look like for projects that are shorter in timescale. And I just wanted to pose a question just in case anyone didn't have any or wanted to think about it, and any kind of thoughts. And I think some of it's come up tonight, but just thinking, how could formal and procedural ethics become more emancipatory? Does the process need an inclusive wake-up call? And I'll leave that there, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Cara. It's quite nice to have a question from you, actually, but I didn't capture that. I need to type it in the chat.
I'll put it in the chat.
Oh yeah, if you could, that'd be great. We got quite a few questions actually, Cara.
That's fine.
Yeah,
I'll take those.
Yeah, I'll let you put a question in the chat, because we don't want the event to stop here, you know, so we would like to have more reflection based on all the presentation today. And for our SIG as well, we have newsletters, so you know, people want to write a blog or something, that would be amazing, you know, so your question could potentially grow into a blog and article. So I'll let you type the chat first, and before I ask the question.
It's copying in very large text, so I'm just going to type it out. There we go. I've put inclusive twice, but I think that's fine. Fabulous.
Thank you. So I'm just going back, there are quite a few questions. The first question we have is from Claire. So when people did not, what methodology are you going to use to bring the different strands of data together for analysis?
So in terms of, I'm drawing on lots of feminist and participatory methodologies, but in terms of analysis, and I'm not quite there yet, so I feel very comfortable drawing to thematic analysis, but it might fit, it might not. And I think, again, as an ethical or an inclusive researcher, it's a willingness to be adaptable to that and trying something out and seeing if it works. So I'm looking at theming, analysing each of the stages separately, but then looking at the links between them, because that's going to be so important as to how that process moves along. And I didn't note before, but I will do some interviews with the co-researchers and ask them how it was for them and what difference this might have made and what influence being researcher has had. So yeah, starting with a real exploratory feminist thematic way of looking, but it might not work, and I'm open to any suggestions from anyone who might know of something that might fit here.
Thank you, Cara. Yes, please do share in the chat. It's also the reason why we have this event, you know, it's about sharing. The next question is, actually that was from me. So what were the major adjustments you have to make during your research process to accommodate the needs of your participants? Obviously, it's complex.
Yes, lots of adjustments, because I never imagined multimodal consent, for example. I knew that some participants were talking or non-talking, but it's how to gather that and how to conduct research in a space where there's lots of other people. So this happens at a weekly club, for example. So do we book private classrooms? Are some people more comfortable doing it in a smaller area of a larger space? So and each week is different. So sometimes I'll go with my researcher hat on and not be able to get it done, and that's fine. And sometimes I don't. And it's that distinction as well, for a place where people are familiar with me. How am I distinguishing when I'm in research mode and when I'm writing notes to when I'm just joining in? So That was one of the adjustments that I had to make, and be very clear with what I was wearing, for example, as those visual cues were really important for some of the participants. They said, "Oh, you're not wearing your lanyard today. Does that mean you're playing with us?" So it's visual things, and just being hyper aware and sensing that you don't have to help just because you know who I am and you think that's the right thing to do, and lots of levels of, are you sure you were happy with that interview we did last week? So lots of that too.
Thank you. I think that is interesting, particularly as an insider researcher. That is probably another area to explore, how to manage different hats, and so on. Moving on, I got next question. Have you thought about working with the co-researchers towards a dissemination strategy? Could be a more comfortable form of closure from their involvement in the research to see end product or resource that they have contributed to.
Yes, definitely. I think firstly, the research committee is something that I have the opportunity to continue beyond the research project. So that in terms of dissemination and seeing what they might like to implement in their club, in their group, or in their community. But also we're thinking of producing some leaflets or some posters and that kind of thing, to make that activity, oh, look, this is what we did. This is what we found out. They've decided they want to get case studies of the other members of the group, which I think is, it's a really nice, it feels like a nice way to close off the research. But that was completely driven by them, to hear what their experience is. So continuing the research committee, and then thinking about what resources, posters, leaflets we might be able to create.
That would be amazing, that kind of ripple out, they actually then take the ownership of sharing that.
Absolutely.
There's another question here from Liz. So have you found the current ethical guidelines to be supportive of progressive studies or restrictive, possibly even so daunting they prevent vital new studies?
Yes. I think I have found ethical guidance restrictive at times, and through conversations with my supervisors, we've had to think, how am I going to work within that restriction? But that's really scary, because when your ethics application doesn't get approved and there's all these questions and you're not quite sure how to answer them, and I said, how am I supposed to know the unknowns? But really it was about evidencing thought to the panel. It was evidencing that I'd thought about it, that I would come back to them if anything was changing. But yeah, I think that things do need to shake up in terms of, how are we talking about intellectual disability in our ethical guidance? Are we only positioning it as vulnerable? Where is the scope to see people individually? And I appreciate that that's a big task, but I think that's not so easy at the moment. So I think it can be preventative, especially when someone might not have as long to give to a study or to ethics approval as I did.
Yeah, I think there's a threat to now about the particular ethical guidelines, they can be a challenge. I'm going to invite Mary Claire Martin to come in, because you got your hands up for a little while. So Mary.
Thanks so much. And sorry I've arrived late. I did hear all your paper, Cara. I was actually taught. So I co-chair or chair two ethics committees, the School of Education, the Faculty of Education, Health and Human Sciences. And we have occasionally had the kind of issues which you raise, which, these are very thoughtful and important issues. So I was just trying to think about how we could address your question. And I was wondering if anyone has come across that, where if there's a kind of framework in place where you don't have to specify everything because you don't know what's going to happen, would that help? And I was also wondering if there are ways that groups could almost take responsibility for ethics, that somehow have to move to a way in which ethics is a participatory activity. It's not something that is just like a tick box, or that those people out there control, and how we could move away from that. Because we do get quite a few people, people often experience committees in a negative way, whereas it isn't intended. So anyway, just what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think a framework is something that I hope to at least share my experience, and as a few people have been doing tonight, and this is what I've been doing, and that can maybe contribute to a researcher's toolkit or something like that. I think to say this might happen, if this doesn't happen, then this might happen, and if none of those are happening, then I'll come back to you. But yeah, I think an opportunity for more flexibility without having to provide the poor panel with 30 additional documents of mine to trawl through. I think the process could become a little bit easier for everyone. But yeah, I'm not quite sure what the framework looks like, but I think it would be interesting to involve our co-researchers in that process, or even thinking about it as an ongoing, the form itself as an ongoing process, as well as ethics on the ground. The form is very formal, and once it's done, you kind of move away from it. So maybe that could be more ongoing in that sense as well.
Well, also for people to have ownership of it, because it's not very meaningful if it's something you have to do for someone else, which I'm sure, you know, you would never think like that, but it's just because it can seem hierarchical to people. There's there's a comment in the chat actually from someone else about, which looks from Alison. I'll pass back to the chair. Thank you, Cara.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. There are lots of comments in the chat at the moment. It's amazing. And comments from Alison about building on the thoughts. I wonder if academic researchers can or should act as mediators between the ethics committee and perhaps, you know, and candidate participant to address challenges of participatory projects and then of co-design. I think this conversation will carry on, and it's amazing topic. You know, we are all very keen. That's why we are here. So I'm going to pass back to Claire, and thank you so much, Cara. It creates lots of discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Cara and Joyce. And I'm really hoping that Alison is the person who's going to bring it all together for us. I've deliberately left her talk till last because of her particular perspective. And Alison is joining us from Cambridge, University of Cambridge. So would you like to tell us more about your project and yourself?
Hi, Claire. Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you all. I just share screen and then I'll get started. Okay, there we go. So yes, very delighted to be here with you all this evening, and I will do my best to bring together some of the threads that we've been discussing this evening. It's been fascinating to hear the discussions and the issues that so many people are considering, and really important to consider. So I'm sort of zooming out a bit in what I'm going to share over the next 15 minutes or so, to think about actually taking practitioner research as a larger scale initiative we all want to engage in. I think everyone here sees very much the value of it. So how can we support the ethical conduct of such research, but particularly the sharing of it? And I'm talking about this from work we're doing at CAMTRE, Cambridge Teacher Research Exchange, which is based at Hughes Hall, one of the colleges within the University of Cambridge, together with my colleagues listed here on this slide. So in this session, I'll talk particularly about a couple of a broader challenge and a specific one related to ethics in practitioner research and how we can respond to that. I'll talk particularly about what CAMTRE is doing in this regard. Think about ethical practice as a kind of professional ideology, and we've heard a bit about being inherently ethical and how we can draw on that in terms of practice toward practitioner research. We'll also think about how we can consider this in terms of the ethical considerations of research and just feed on these steps rather than something completely different, and close with some next steps in concluding remarks. So a key challenge that we're seeking to respond to is that there is a vast body of research about education and educational practice, but the large majority of it is conducted by academic researchers and published in academic journals. And so in contrast, or in comparison, educators' voices and expertise tend to be rather marginalized
or relatively absent. And this is in spite of the fact that practitioner inquiry, teacher research is actually pretty established as a field. There are various approaches, various tools, lots of professional development programs, lots of master's programs that embed this, but the outcomes of this are rarely shared beyond local insights and local context. Now, of course, those local learnings are really important for practitioners' own professional development, for learners in their context, but it stops that wider sharing and that wider community learning on the basis of this. And then, of course, when we're looking at sharing beyond those local connections, the ethical considerations of practitioner research become far more complicated, so much so that it's often considered easier not to share the findings. But we could flip that on its head and say, actually, we've got all of these infrastructures and mechanisms within academic research that are considered important and paramount in maintaining academic ethical research. But is it actually unethical if these are used as barriers to the sharing of practitioner research? And so how can we support those infrastructures and support those practices to be embedded more widely? So how countries seeking to shift this balance then is by working to support the conduct and sharing of practitioner research, both in terms of communities that can discuss aspects of research within practice, a platform that hosts courses and resources around conducting practitioner inquiry. We also host a digital library of published practitioner research reports. We are building, so it's relatively small at the moment, but given that practitioner research is rarely shared, I think it's actually either is the largest library of such collections or one of the largest. But it's a place we want to build from, clearly. So we're not just offering a space for publication, but support for it, including through peer review processes. And using that, again, as mentioned, that it's an enabling mechanism to support toward publication and not as a barrier stopping from things being shared. But we need quality criteria to ensure that what is shared is ethically conducted and ethically shared and rigorous and transparent. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'll just unpack a couple of questions related to this, thinking about what a professional ideology is and how this relates to research ethics, and then unpack that a bit more aligned to ethical guidelines for academic research and how we can draw on these in that context of a professional ideology to support ethical practitioner research being conducted and published. So Michael Arrow wrote about professional ideology then as being a theoretical justification of a profession's purposes and practices in terms of moral principles, views of society, and occupational beliefs about the effectiveness of various practices. So it's that sense of what good practice is about. Again, we're reminded of that being inherently ethical and what it is to actually consider what would be good, how we can support learners to learn as best as they can, and how we can support our own professional development and that of our colleagues to develop healthily and well in the profession. And if we take try and make a concrete example of what professional ideology of practice might be, and I really unpack that a bit, we could consider the example of taking a group of learners on a trip. And I'm sorry if the amount of paperwork involved in this sort of sends shivers down people's spines, but this is sort of embedded, implicit, tacit within professional ideology. So with this kind of activity, there's probably some kind of risk assessment. There will be a certain amount of just telling people what's happening, where you're going, what times, anything that's different to normal. You'll have to give contact details, and that's often two-way so that you can be contacted and you can maintain contact back. There'll be permission probably from learners that they can go, probably a backup plan for anyone who can't attend on this trip or might need to have alternative arrangements, and probably some form of formal approval from the institution. So it's an example of how professional ideology can be instantiated. And it's not too much of a leap to see that some of these actually involve some kind of ethical consideration for learners and for practice. So if we extend this a bit further then to think of a professional ideology of a practitioner researcher, it's driven by those embedded mechanisms of safeguarding and risk assessment that can then be used to drive good research practice. So thinking what learners will enjoy or not, What might make it more difficult? What might make it more rewarding or enjoyable? Within this, there's also a consideration of how we can support openness and an ethos of dialogue with learners, so that learning and learning spaces become safe spaces to take risks with learning, to engage and to explore ideas with each other and make them more meaningful. It also involves an openness of communications with colleagues and other stakeholders, including parents, including parent governors, and how we can bring people in to really explore and make practice as beneficial as we can. And we also need to consider, and many practitioner researchers will do this, how we share those challenges and successes, particularly important in both counts. If something is proving difficult, we're more likely to be able to come up with a solution or a few solutions by sharing it and discussing those critical ideas with others, and successes so that we can actually all learn from when things go well, and really important professional well-being and for professional development. So coming to the second question then, we can think about this aligned to the ethical guidelines of academic research and how these can come together to consider conducting and publishing ethical practitioner research. So I'm going to use, we've heard about the BERA's guidelines for academic research, and they are, of course, a really important cornerstone that we can draw on for this. But I've listed here two sort of really critical elements that are different in the context of practitioner research that we need to address before we even get to those 5 guidelines. So firstly, how do we differentiate what's practice, what's normal activity within the context, and what's research? And when does trying to improve practice and make learning more beneficial in some way actually cross over into being research? So we can think about this in terms of, are we trying something or exploring something in a deep way? Or perhaps we're gathering data, and particularly if we're gathering data with an intent to share it. So not just the regular kind of data we might collect for monitoring or for general educational purposes, but to actually understand the process a bit better. And we've definitely heard about the Ethics Review Committee. I think we've heard quite a bit about that, and importantly so tonight. But this is something that's often missing. And again, we've heard about that. How can we link up with someone else? But how can we do that within the context and the networks that practitioners might have themselves? What sounding boards, what other mentors or second opinions can people go to have those critical learning conversations that mean they can make these sort of tacit ethical practice, professional ideologies of doing good practice? How can they make that explicit so that they can ensure their practitioner research and efforts to improve practice are ethically informed? So then thinking about practitioner research and ethics within the context of BERA's guidelines, of course, all of these are still really critical, but there are ways that we can show that we're considering these in a practitioner research context. So minimizing risk of harm and maximizing benefits. It's really important to consider the power differential when you've got that regular relationship already. You've got something there which you can build on, which is an opportunity to maximize the benefits of that relationship that's already there. But it can complicate things in terms of, again, what's regular practice and what's additional in terms of the research. So it's making sure that those differences are really clear to participants so that they know what they have to do or what's expected if in a compulsory setting, and what might be optional to them. And of course, this context of dialogue and openness that learners feel they can contribute and challenge is important in maintaining that balance. And also having contact details for people of someone else if participants don't feel that they can contact or challenge the practitioner who's leading the research as well. In terms of informed consent, we've heard, and absolutely this is a cornerstone of ethical research. So a good way to check about this is to ask if someone saw their work or their data or a quote of themselves written somewhere or published, would they be surprised? And if we think they would, then that consent perhaps hasn't been fully informed. So we can break that down to think, well, who needs to know? What do they need to know and when? We've heard some really fascinating discussions about age and is learner consent enough? And there are various issues we need to consider there in terms of actually empowering the voices of those that we want to hear from. And so I will leave that in the hands of Lois and Kate, who shared earlier. But where we are sharing information, we need to consider that actually, is it accessible and clearly distinguishing regular practice from research practice, so that we can ensure that consent is genuinely informed. Thinking about anonymity and confidentiality, again, we've heard a bit about this, and particularly as with Louise's context, if a practitioner researcher is an identifiable author in an identifiable context, it does have ramifications for potential colleagues and participants of that research. We have to consider, can we actually keep them anonymous? Or are there ways that we can group findings or not present exact quotes that can mean data can still be shared and research insights shared without actually identifying specific participants? But on the flip side, we should perhaps consider, depending on the age or the competence and capacity of participants, decide if this is something they're passionate about or a success story. Do learners and participants actually want to be kept anonymous, or might they want to be identified against their contributions and accredited as such? Moving on to the aspect of deception, this is generally a really important point, and where possible we avoid deception and deceiving participants as to what's being involved. But there are some instances where holding some information back might be important to avoid leading responses or altering behaviour. But if so, we should still ensure that we share real reasons and offer the opportunity to ask questions at the earliest opportunity, and ensure that participants know that what they're sharing and their participation might be used as data, and how so. And looking at the final guideline and the right to withdraw, this again is really important, where there's practice and research that can often be intermingled, and do learners really know what they can opt out of, what they can perhaps not be recorded from or such, without sense of repercussion. And those alternative contact details for someone can be really important in really empowering that. So that's just a really whistle stop of a few suggestions. We do have a course that we've just launched, an online asynchronous short course to support reflection and some tips and resources around conducting and sharing ethical practitioner research. And there's a QR code down at the bottom if anyone wants to access that. And I'm very happy to share that with people. So something that people can work through. And just to return to the element of quality criteria and peer review for publication, we have 8 criteria for submissions put into CAMTRI, one of which criteria 5 on this is around good research practice. And so all submissions that are put through and sent to CAMTRI do have to show that they've considered ethical considerations in writing and conducting the research that they offer. And so just to conclude then, practitioner research represents a hugely valuable and valid voice in the educational knowledge base, but sadly it is very rarely heard. Ethics of practitioner research has additional layers of consideration that we really must consider when sharing the outcomes of research. But we argue that building on a professional ideology of ethical practice, recognising practitioner researcher communities as connections and ethical sounding boards, to have those conversations to make tacit ethical considerations explicit, we can work to really protect what's important, but share what's beneficial and learn from each other. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Claire.
Fabulous and fabulous timekeeping. Thank you so much, Alison. I think you sort of anticipated one of my questions there, really, with your last slide about, I was going to ask about how the digital library encouraged people to be explicit about their ethics, and that is one of your selection criteria. I think there's one of my first thoughts when I read through your abstract was about this really feeds into discussions about the quality of practitioner research as well, that often are the challenge to practitioner research is often based on the quality of the research. So I think what you're doing is really trying to support the quality, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, I think we're trying to break down what's involved in practitioner research and offer those prompts, so that, you know, we've heard that a huge barrier to practitioner research being published in academic journals is the fact that they've not gone through an ethics review committee. So of course we acknowledge for most practitioner researchers, that's not going to be possible. And so that's a really unrealizable barrier for many people. But actually, there are ways to show that research has been conducted ethically. And to really reflect on that is often more ethically mindful than just saying, we got ethical approval. And that's a tick box.
Yeah. Oh, we've got a hand up. I'm just trying to work out who that is. Amelia, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. You touched on this in your last slide or the one before about when is practice research. So this is a question about some work we've been doing in schools about changing whole school approaches to better support well-being. So it's not about an individual child, but it might be about changing a congested lunchtime queue that causes a lot of stress. So in this example, the school did a survey of children as to whether how they felt in lunchtime, happy, sad, anxious, etc. And then they redid it after they'd changed the processes. So my question is, I think that's a nice case study, but the school wouldn't have got informed consent from the children to be part of that survey. So does that make this a no-go, or is it potentially reportable because it was a group temperature taking of how they felt about the changes in lunchtime? I'm just really curious on any kind of steer on this.
It's an interesting question, and I suppose it depends what relationships and understandings the school would normally have with learners and with parents, if that's appropriate. You know, if it's a school who might generally seek to understand how they can improve situations in the school and around the arrangements, then maybe that is something that learners might expect. Oh, you know, school's interested in how I read best, or in how the lunch queue flows best. Then maybe there is an element of being informed about that. I mean, I don't know how the survey was presented, if they were given it by the teacher and the teacher said, we're interested to know about X.
Yes, so it was, and it was smiley faces. So
Yeah.
It was big smiley face for lunchtime goes great, and big frown if it doesn't. So that was the way in which it was done, sort of in forms. Yeah. But I like the nuance of your questions. I think this is really interesting.
Okay, great, thanks, Amelia.
I might just chip in. I think there's a line, isn't there, between what schools might do in terms of a reflective cycle, both about what they choose to do in terms of learning and teaching or community building or activity. And a couple of schools that I've worked at took the line of, if we're collecting information that we would normally collect, like scores or grades, in order for children to learn, then we can use that to work on developments. When they asked for a little bit more informed consent was when it was additional. So in this instance, possibly that would have counted as being additional because it was a specific moment in time that they were looking at. But subsequently that school then changed, and their pupil charter, so when your parents signed their parental agreement, there was a line in it which said we may occasionally survey students anonymously for the benefit of the, and had a couple of different things written in their charter that parents signed. I think it moves over a threshold if you are going to publish these things. And once we get into the realms of you're publishing findings from any kind of work that you've done, whether that be, I mean, in old school money, wasn't it, like LEA, lead teaching, or if you were, contributing to some conference or some teach meet. I think once you start taking that information outside of the organisation, I think I would really veer on the side of caution and have some kind of ethical consideration, as Alison says, possibly not an ethics committee, but that you have done some reflective work on that within your institution would be kind of where I put that. But there are far more authoritative voices on the chat than mine today.
No, that's not true, not at all. I mean, I think the whole point of our practitioner research SIG is to give a platform to these kinds of discussions. So, that's why we've done this, because we recognise it's important. And I think one of the things tonight as well is that this idea of collaborations between institutions really helps it protect the process for everyone concerned. I'm wondering, one of the things I get worried about as a practitioner researcher based in a school is the way that some groups of students are over-researched, particularly vulnerable groups of students. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the ethics of, should we limit the amount of research that can be done on, say, SEND children?
I suppose that depends on context, and it depends on the researcher and the local need it's serving. I think with practitioner research, you would like to think it serves a local purpose first, and then is shared more widely for broader benefit. So I'm not sure it would be appropriate to limit research. We might want to give more a voice to research that tends not to be heard, and to give that a platform. But I don't feel it would be appropriate to.
I think it's more
maybe I've misunderstood. Policy. Sorry.
Well, I think it's more that schools get approached by external researchers who are doing a project on, say, intellectual disability. So that happens quite regularly. So then just suppose that is a decision, an ethical decision for the school, isn't it?
Yeah.
How much are our young people a resource for researchers if it is not serving, as you say? Maybe that's the guideline. Is there any local benefit?
Yeah, I think so.
A vulnerable group.
Yeah, and it comes back to that principle of minimizing harm and maximizing benefits. If the balance is not there, then I suppose you say no. Really. So I think it does have to serve the learners in that context, and hopefully the practitioners as well who benefit from it too.
Yeah, and I can see that Lois has got her hand up. I think there's time for one more question.
Well, I was just a reflection really about kind of my own project when I was initially looking for organisations to work with, and a lot of responses that I got initially were that they couldn't get involved because of kind of research fatigue, and that the young people were involved in so many different projects that they didn't want to kind of use up any more of their time and kind of energy and quite emotive conversations. So I think perhaps that comes into the conversation that you were just having about that. But at the end of the day, I suppose it's the organisation and the gatekeepers that make that decision. And even if there is a local need, it could be that actually there's just, the young person or whatever kind of group it is has to come first, and their well-being and that sort of thing. And it's not always possible to facilitate all of these important projects. And that was just a little reflection on that.
We have to thank you, and we have to thank Alison as our last speaker. This is now our sort of 10-minute discussion time where we have a free-for-all, where any of the audience or speakers can reflect on the session. And I can see that Mary Claire Martin has got her hand up. Would you like to speak?
Oh, thank you. Oh, well, thank you so much, Alison. Again, that was really illuminating. And I suppose because what I see is the different perspectives. We're looking at students. So we're looking at trainee teachers, education studies students who want to do research with children in schools. And I really sympathise with that question about whether we should be looking at groups of students who are often over-researched, because, I mean, from my perspective, sometimes it looks quite exploitative. The students doing it because they want to get a qualification. But, our job as an ethics committee is actually to, although we're not in the school, it's our job to protect those children. And it's quite difficult because we had something recently where a college agreed to create a special list of students with a certain level of attendance and send stuff out anonymously. And, people above me agreed to this. But I actually thought, this is targeting a vulnerable group, so you can sort of say we're meeting the letter of the law, but we're not actually meeting the spirit of the law. So anyway, but these are things that really bother me. So yeah, any further thoughts would be good. But I also had another question, which is whether people think the BERA guidelines are up to date now, because, within our university policy, there are all kinds of things we've had to thrash out, which are not necessarily, you know, you can't just go to BERA and get the answer from those guidelines after it's nearly 6 years. Sorry, 2 questions, cheating. Just pick up whatever you want.
Yeah, I think maybe I might have just answered that one in the chat, that second half of that. I think it's not uncommon knowledge really that we're looking at these ethical guidelines in terms of social science qualitative research practices, particularly educational research. I'm not sure it's completely as up to date as we'd like it to be. We've had back and forth, I think, on a number of platforms. I realise that's not maybe the official answer everyone's looking for, but I think it is. Powers that be might be aware that it's not maybe suiting all purposes. Often in universities, the first question they ask are, will your research be on human participants? And once you tick yes to that box, you get a whole different can of worms. And I'm not quite sure that the ethics actually is reasonably measured or targeted towards qualitative social science-based research. I think they just often reuse that positivist approach to things, and it's not quite fit for purpose really at the same time, or without being too inflammatory.
I'm not a scientist, I'm a historian, so in fact I think we have a really good I think we do have a good mix of disciplines in our university committee. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I feel like I'm talking too much.
Not at all. That's fine. We have 6 minutes left. Mary, is your hand still up?
No, legacy hand.
Legacy hand, lovely. Anyone else got a reflection or question based on the session? I think
we've had a couple of comments along the lines. Sorry, I'm just thinking in the chat we've had quite a few, and Gillian as well has mentioned, and I think a person further up in the chat said it's nice to see lots of people grappling with these issues. And I think just the number of people we've got here today and the number of people who registered to watch it online. So hello to anyone who's watching it at a different time. It just demonstrates how important it is that we just keep talking about these things and being aware that it is constantly something that we're developing together. So it's lovely to see everybody, and like Gillian said, it's reassuring to know that others are thinking about it.
And that sort of, where is the tension between it being inclusive and to some extent exclusive, in that this is specialized knowledge, isn't it? An understanding of ethics is in itself a specialized form of knowledge. So where do we find that balance between inclusivity and the need to have training, for example, in this? I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on that. Can it ever be fully inclusive?
Yeah, because this is, sort of a continual sort of conversation that I would probably have with all of the school and faculty-based ethics committees when we get together, because I think this broader kind of sense around if we start from the premise of wanting to have high quality research integrity in everything that we do, and that kind of links in really, I think, nicely to what Alison was just talking about there, about that professional kind of identity and as kind of researchers too, then if we have that as the base, then we're always kind of seeking about what is the most appropriate way to interact with, if we are working with kind of human beings, what is the most appropriate way to kind of work with our participants, and what is actually the benefit to that. We've spoken a lot about that, I think, tonight as well, about there should be some benefit to the people that we are engaging with, that this kind of sense, quite an old school sense of, you can kind of see it when often people kind of write ethics applications. Oh, I want to use this group to get some data from. It's that kind of sense about what is actually the relationship between you as the researcher and the people that you're kind of working with, or even the data that you're collecting from somewhere else, even if it's like secondary data. If that's being produced by someone at some point, then we should have some care about how we're planning on using it and where it's going to end up, and whether or not people are being informed properly about where that material is going. I mean, probably most people are having lots and lots of conversation around generative AI kind of stuff at the moment and how that's going to inform research practice in the future. Like really challenging conversations at the moment about what on earth are we supposed to do really right now in terms of levels of expertise about what kind of materials being introduced and how it's going to be worked. So I just think we need to kind of understand that it's moving all of the time, that we get different types of insights all of the time, and that we should be okay enough and flexible enough to be adaptable to our guidance notes and our ways of kind of working. And if things aren't working, that we can adapt, so that it's not like, oh my God, this is just one thing, and well, it's different to kind of last year, and oh, this is causing me loads of extra kind of hassle. It's like, this is actually really good. We're trying to be adaptive to the context we're working in. That's kind of how I'm seeing it in my context at the moment anyway.
Thank you. That's brilliant. And Mary, have you got your hand up? Mary Claire.
No, it's a legacy story. But I did have another example where this idea of whether it's actually harmful. So this is a module on it's for an external partner college, and we're looking to, it's a module on mentoring, and it's education studies, not teacher training, though that might not make a difference. And the mentor wanted to take a child out of class and do a kind of Kim's game, memory game. And this was a child with some form of intellectual SEN. And I was just thinking, well, how is this going to benefit the child to do a memory game, which is a competitive activity, probably affect their self-esteem, because they would almost certainly, not almost certainly, but it's quite likely they wouldn't be able to do it. And, when they could have been in class, and there could have been some other much more developmental activity, on a one-to-one with an adult. I mean, I'd be really interested what everyone else thinks about this, because I'm inclined to say it's not actually, appropriate for this to happen, and they have to rethink it.
We're definitely going to have to continue this discussion, and thank you.
Really helpful.
Yes, thank you everybody, speakers, participants, and the people, as Kate said, who are going to watch it online. Any last thoughts from my co-conveners?
I just want to say we actually had received a lot of abstracts, so I think we definitely want to run more of those events, because we need more of this kind of discussion going on. I just want to invite people, to continue this, whether it's newsletters, invite your reflections, or a blog, to do some joint blogs. That would be amazing. So yeah, thank you.
And we might have a vacancy for a co-convener for practitioner research, so send them in. But thank you everybody for your contributions today, and to Emma, who couldn't be here.
Yeah, and thank you everyone. Thank you, Claire and Kate.
Night everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.